You can sleep at the terminal tonight. Maybe one night here will teach you to know your place.
Don't look up my ticket. Check who owns this airline.
Right away, ma'am.
3 hours after I buried my mother, I walked into Blue Heron Regional Airport with a small suitcase, a black coat, and nothing left to lose. When I entered my confirmation code at the self-check-in machine, the screen flashed 2 words, "Ticket canceled." I thought it was a system error until I heard his laugh. My husband Colin was standing near the departure gate, his arm wrapped around a woman named Sierra who was holding the boarding pass that should have been mine. He looked straight at me and said, "You can sleep at the terminal tonight. Maybe one night here will teach you to know your place." His mother cheered him on. His brother raised his phone to record my reaction. They were all waiting for me to break down and beg. Instead, I walked to the service counter, gave the agent my private code, and said, "Don't look up my ticket. Check who owns this airline." What happened next, none of them saw coming. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay with me. This one's for you. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. Stories like this one come out every week. I grew up in Briar Glen, Mississippi, in a house so small that the kitchen table touched both walls. My father died when I was 7, and after that it was just my mother, Dorothy, and me, and the sound of her sewing machine running late into the night. She made uniforms for the hospital staff in town, altered wedding dresses, repaired work clothes for men who couldn't afford new ones. She never complained about any of it. She just kept the needle moving and the house standing. When I was 16, she pressed a small silver compass into my hand. It was old and slightly dented, the kind of thing that looked like it had already survived a few hard seasons. On the back, she had asked a jeweler to engrave 4 words: "Stand tall, walk free." She told me those words weren't a wish. They were instructions. The difference, she said, was everything. I carried that compass through college, through the early years of building something from nothing, through every moment. I wasn't sure I was going to make it. It was in my coat pocket the afternoon I walked into that airport 3 hours after I placed the last flowers on her grave at Oak Lantern Memorial Gardens and told her I would be okay. I wasn't sure that was true yet. But I said it anyway because I think that's what she would have wanted. People assume that when you build something, the size of what I built, there must have been a single cinematic turning point where everything changed. The truth is less dramatic. After college, I wrote a piece of software that could predict supply chain failures in regional air transport during natural disasters. I wasn't thinking about becoming a billionaire. I was thinking about a documentary I had seen as a child about a rural town that ran out of insulin after a flood because no plane could get through in time. That image stayed with me for years until I did something about it. From a rented office with 3 employees, I built Airline Aviation Group into a network that now includes regional carriers, private airports, maintenance facilities, and a medical transport division operating across the country. My personal net worth sits at nearly $12 billion. But the public knows the founder of Airline only by her maiden name, Sabrina Keen. In my private life, I go by Sabrina Vance, my married name, and I've always described my work as remote operational consulting. Low profile, deliberately vague, easy to overlook. My husband Colin never knew the real scale of what I was doing. I want to be careful about how I explain that, because it's easy to make it sound like a test, like I was hiding my identity to see how he would treat me without the money. That wasn't it. In the early years of our relationship, I tried to tell him. I talked about flight logistics and infrastructure contracts and the thing I was building. Colin would listen for about 90 seconds before his eyes found something more interesting across the room. Eventually, he'd say, "Just focus on your spreadsheets, babe. Leave the real business stuff to me." He said it without cruelty, the way someone dismisses background noise. And after enough times, I stopped trying to explain and started keeping it separate. Not as a strategy, but as a matter of self-preservation. I kept my assets in a private trust and maintained a prenuptial property agreement that Colin signed before our wedding, without reading past the first page. He assumed it was there to protect my mother's small house back in Briar Glen. He never imagined it was there to protect something considerably larger. Colin Vance was charming, in the way that certain men are charming effortlessly, selectively, and always in public. He ran a small resort development company called Vance Leisure Partners and spent money the way people spend money when they are more committed to the appearance of success than to success itself. He leased a car he couldn't afford to buy, wore a watch on an installment plan he never mentioned, and hosted dinners where the guest list mattered more than the conversation. He told people he was the one carrying the household. He believed it, and that was the part that took me the longest to understand. He genuinely believed the story he told about himself, even as the numbers in his company were quietly going in the wrong direction. I knew Vance Leisure Partners was struggling. I didn't know how badly until much later. And I didn't know that 18 months before everything fell apart, Colin had started working with a woman named Sierra Vaughn, a social media strategist who helped entrepreneurs build personal brands and attract investors. He approached her as a client. He told her he was managing a significant portfolio, that his wife worked quietly in the background by choice, and that he was the financial engine of the family. Sierra was good at her job. She built Colin's image carefully and professionally, and had no reason yet to question the foundation she was building on. Their relationship moved past professional over time, the way those things do when someone is being told exactly what they want to hear. Colin told Sierra things about himself that weren't true, and she believed him because he was consistent, convincing, and the version of himself he was presenting had been carefully constructed to hold up under casual scrutiny. I'm not telling this part of the story to excuse what happened. I'm telling it because Sierra's story doesn't end the way Colin expected it to, and that part deserves to be told correctly. Colin's younger brother Wade was a different kind of presence in this family. He was the one at every gathering with his phone already in his hand, ready to capture whatever moment might be worth posting. He had built a following on reaction content, the small humiliations, the social missteps, the awkward confrontations that people find entertaining when they're happening to someone else. Colin and their mother Elaine had always encouraged it, treating Wade's camera like a tool for shaping the narrative before anyone else could. What most people didn't notice about Wade was that he had a line. He had never posted anything that made his own family look genuinely monstrous. He knew the difference between entertainment and damage, even if he didn't always articulate it. At family dinners, when Colin talked about my work with the particular tone he reserved for things beneath serious consideration, Elaine would nod and Wade would go quiet and look somewhere else. He never defended me. But he never piled on either. I filed that away without fully realizing I was doing it. Elaine Vance had never thought I was right for her son. She communicated it mostly through tone and implication, though sometimes she used words too. She believed Colin deserved someone who moved through the world the way he did, loudly, with visible markers of arrival. I was too quiet, too self-contained. In her mind, a woman who didn't announce herself wasn't worth paying attention to, and she had spent 12 years making sure I felt that. My mother got sick in the spring. The doctors called it cardiac events at first, then a series of them, and then they stopped framing it as events and started framing it as a condition. I flew back to Briar Glen and stayed. I cooked her meals, drove her to appointments, and sat with her in the evenings while she sewed small things, pillowcases, dish towels, fabric squares with no destination. I think it calmed her to have her hands moving. I sat beside her with my laptop, and for a few weeks, the two of us existed in a quiet that felt like the realest thing in my life. Colin called every few days. He said he was sorry he couldn't be there, that the timing was terrible, that a new resort project was in a critical phase. I told him I understood. I'm not sure I fully did, but I said it because I was tired, and my mother was sleeping in the next room, and I didn't have the energy to open that door. He didn't come for the funeral either. Dorothy Keen was buried on a Tuesday morning at Oak Lantern Memorial Gardens, under a sky that couldn't decide between gray and blue. The minister said things that were true about her. Her neighbors came. The woman who owned the alterations shop 2 blocks over cried harder than I expected. I placed white flowers on the grave, stood there until I felt the ground under my feet again, then went back to her house. Changed my clothes, picked up my suitcase, and drove to Blue Heron Regional Airport for the last flight back to San Diego. At the self-check-in machine, I entered my confirmation code. The screen returned a message: reservation canceled. I entered the code again. Same result. I assumed a system glitch, the kind of minor inconvenience that happens when you're exhausted and just want to get on a plane and close your eyes. Then I heard him laugh. Colin was standing near the departure gate, close enough that I could see his face clearly. He wasn't supposed to be in Mississippi. He had told me he was in Arizona for a conference. But there he was with Sierra beside him in something light and bright, holding a boarding pass in her hand. Elaine stood nearby with her arms crossed. Wade had his phone up before I even reached them. I asked Colin what was going on. He told me calmly, without lowering his voice, that Sierra needed to get back to finalize a presentation. He had accessed our shared family travel account, canceled my reservation, taken the credit, and used it to purchase the last available seat on the flight for her. "She's helping save our future," he said. "You can rent a car or stay here tonight. Maybe one night at the terminal will remind you that the world doesn't stop just because you're sad." Elaine said I was overreacting, and that a good wife understood how to put her husband's career before her own feelings. Sierra wasn't looking at me directly. Her eyes were fixed slightly to the left of my face, the way someone looks when they are beginning to wonder whether the story they were told and the story they are actually standing inside are the same story. Wade held the phone steady and waited for me to come apart. I felt the compass in my coat pocket. I thought about 4 words pressed into silver. I didn't go after Colin. I didn't reach for Sierra's boarding pass. I picked up my suitcase and walked to the service counter where the agent, his name tag read. Micah looked up as I approached. I set my bag down and said, "I need you to pull a passenger record under my maiden name, Sabrina Keen." Micah typed. He found the name, but the account flags required a secondary verification he hadn't encountered before. I reached into my bag, took out a card I had carried for years and rarely used, and read him the internal executive identification code printed on the back, the code known only to Airline's senior board members and operations leadership. Then I said, "Don't look for my ticket. Check the ownership record for the carrier operating this flight." That was the moment I chose to stop being the version of myself I had built to make someone else comfortable. Micah stared at his screen for a moment longer than was professional, which told me he had found what I knew he would find. The profile attached to my identification code didn't match the woman standing in front of him. A woman in a plain black dress, no security detail, no assistant, no visible markers of wealth. The profile belonged to the founder and controlling shareholder of Airline Aviation Group, one of the largest privately held aviation networks in the country. The carrier operating today's flight to San Diego. The ground services at this terminal, the maintenance contract for the aircraft on the tarmac, all of it fell within Orleans' network. All of it fell within what I owned. He asked if I had secondary documentation to confirm the record. His voice was careful, the way people sound when they're managing uncertainty and don't want to make an expensive mistake in either direction. Colin heard him ask. He walked over from the gate with the easy confidence of a man who has never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong in a room. He told Micah that I was grieving, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that I was a work-from-home consultant who occasionally overstated the significance of her own projects. He suggested gently and with visible concern that the agent not allow me to delay the boarding process. Elaine spoke up behind him loudly enough for the people nearby to hear. She's always done this, always pretending to be more than she is. Wade moved closer with the phone. The crowd around us had shifted into that particular configuration people assume when they've decided something interesting is happening, some pulling out their own devices, some just watching the low murmur of a terminal recalibrating its attention. A few passengers had already concluded I was a woman attempting a false identity claim to secure a seat upgrade. Someone near the gate used the word delusional at a volume I wasn't meant to miss. I had spent nearly 2 decades maintaining the gap between Sabrina Vance and Sabrina Keen, with careful, unglamorous consistency, separate accounts, a legal structure that kept the trust invisible at the surface level, public appearances made only under my professional name. I had been so deliberate about staying out of the light that now, standing in the middle of a terminal full of strangers, the very privacy I had built was being used against me. There was no easy proof that didn't require someone with system access to confirm it. And in the meantime, the man who had shared my life for 12 years was filling the air with a narrative designed to make me look unstable. Micah made a call. I watched him speak quietly into the receiver, listened to the transfer go through, once, then twice, then a third time, up through the regional operations chain until it reached the right level. Colin stayed nearby, talking to Elaine and Wade and the general atmosphere, building his version of events for anyone who was listening. I didn't respond. I stood at the counter with my hands still and waited. 10 minutes later, Lenora Phelps walked through the terminal doors. Lenora was Airline's chief operating officer, a woman who had been with the company for 11 years and who did not under any circumstances move faster than the situation required. She came through the doors at her usual pace, deliberate, unbothered, accompanied by the airport's general manager and 2 members of the operations security team. She didn't scan the room for context. She walked directly to me, stopped, and said, "Mrs. Keen, I'm deeply sorry for the delay, and I'm deeply sorry about your mother." The terminal went quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet when something has shifted and everyone present can feel it, but nobody yet understands what it means. Lenora turned toward Micah and the general manager and confirmed without embellishment that I was the founder, chairwoman, and controlling shareholder of Airline Aviation Group. The aircraft on the tarmac, the carrier running this route, and the majority of ground services at Blue Heron Regional Airport all fell within the network I owned. I watched Colin's face move through several expressions in quick succession. First, genuine confusion, the kind that happens when the floor moves before you've registered there was ever any possibility of movement. Then something closer to recalculation, his eyes going slightly unfocused as he ran the numbers and tried to find a version of this moment he could still manage. He asked in a voice quieter and somehow younger than his usual register, "You're Sabrina Keen." "I've always been Sabrina," I said. "You just never asked enough questions to find out who that actually was." Sierra let go of his arm. Not dramatically, her hand simply released the fabric of his sleeve and dropped to her side. She looked down at the boarding pass she was holding, and I recognized the expression on her face because I had worn it myself at various points over the years, the expression of someone realizing that the story they had been told about the situation they were in had been authored by someone with a significant interest in their not knowing the full version. Elaine had stopped talking. Wade still had his phone raised, but the quality of his attention had changed entirely. He wasn't filming a reaction piece anymore. He was filming something he hadn't anticipated, and the uncertainty of what to do with that was visible in the tension around his eyes. Lenora offered to restore my booking, upgrade me to first class, or arrange an executive aircraft. I told her I didn't want the seat back. I wasn't going to displace Sierra from this flight. Whatever role she had played in the afternoon's events, being stranded in grief was not something I was willing to use as an instrument, not today. What I asked for instead was a security hold on Colin's access to my personal travel accounts and a complete data record of every action taken on my reservation in the past 48 hours. Micah confirmed the access logs were already flagged for documentation. Then I looked at Colin and said, "You didn't just cancel my flight home. You canceled your place in my life." Colin didn't apologize. What he did instead, once the initial shock had settled and his thinking had found its footing again, was adapt. Within minutes of Lenora's confirmation, he had shifted from defensive to conciliatory, touching my arm, calling me sweetheart, at a volume meant to be heard, saying that of course he had always been proud of everything I built, that this was all a terrible miscommunication. When I stepped back from his hand, something behind his eyes cooled and set, and I understood we had moved from one phase of this into the next. He told me quietly enough that only I could hear that any assets Aureline generated during our marriage were marital property, that he had set aside his own ambitions to support mine, that if I intended to walk away, I would find out very quickly how far I could actually go. By the time I left the airport in a rental car Lenora had arranged, Wade had already posted a clip online. It was short and carefully constructed. It opened at the moment Lenora addressed me by name and ended well before the part where Colin told me to sleep at the terminal. In the version Wade uploaded, I appeared to be a wealthy woman deploying institutional authority to intimidate a regular family and remove another passenger from a commercial flight. The caption framed it as a powerful wife publicly humiliating a husband who had no idea who he had married. The clip moved fast. By morning, it had accumulated enough shares that 2 journalists had reached out to Aureline's communications team. By the following day, Colin had given an interview in which he said with practiced steadiness, "I woke up after 12 years and realized I never knew the woman sleeping beside me." Sierra appeared in a separate piece and said only that she had been working with Colin as a communications consultant and preferred not to comment on his personal life, the careful, minimal language of someone who is beginning to suspect they have been someone else's instrument and is not yet ready to say so publicly. Within the week, a state-level medical transport contract worth several $100 million was placed under administrative review. Aureline's board convened an emergency session. They were not unkind, but they were clear given the public nature of the incident and the questions being raised about whether I'd used operational authority to resolve a personal dispute. They needed an independent review before my direct executive access could continue. I still owned the company, but I was temporarily suspended from running it. I drove back to Briar Glen with the radio off and let myself into my mother's house with the spare key she had kept under a ceramic frog on the porch for 30 years. I stood in her kitchen without turning on the lights. The coffee cup she used on her last morning was still upside down on the drying rack. Her sewing machine was uncovered. Her slippers were beside the bed, placed neatly toes toward the door. I sat down at the sewing machine and put my hand flat on the worn wooden surface around it. In 12 years of marriage, I had learned to fill loneliness with work. In the weeks of caring for my mother, I had learned to fill fear with tasks. But in that kitchen in the dark, there was nothing left to fill. No system to manage, no call to take, no next thing to move toward. For the first time since the funeral, I cried. Not because of the flight or the suspension or the video, but because the one person I wanted to call, the one who would have listened to all of it, and then said something short and precise that made everything else feel manageable, was gone. And no amount of money or aircraft or legal strategy was going to change that. I don't know how long I sat at that sewing machine in the dark. Long enough for my eyes to adjust, long enough for the house to stop feeling like an emergency and start feeling like what it actually was, the place where someone I loved had lived and now didn't. At some point, I reached up and turned on the small lamp my mother kept above her work table, the one with the pale yellow shade she had owned since before I was born. In the low light, I noticed something tucked beneath the base of the machine, a white envelope with my name on the front, written in her handwriting. She had written it before she died. The paper carried the faint scent of lavender sachets from her dresser drawers, which meant it had been sitting there for some time waiting for me to come back and find it. She said she had always known my marriage was not what I wanted people to think it was. She had watched me over the years become quieter when Colin was in the room. Not the quiet of someone at peace, but the quiet of someone who had learned that taking up less space made things easier. She said she never raised it directly because she didn't think it was her place to name something I hadn't chosen to name yet. But she wanted me to know she had seen it. She had always seen it. Near the end of the letter, she wrote, "When people lie about who you are, don't try to outshout them. Open the door and let the whole truth walk in." I read that line 3 times. Then I folded the letter and put it in my coat pocket next to the compass, the letter she had written when she knew she was running out of time, and the compass she had given me when she believed I had all of it ahead of me. 2 different objects, the same instruction. I had a choice to make, and she had known somehow that I would be sitting here making it. I could have taken Colin apart with what I had. The financial records alone, the loans he had taken using our marriage as implied collateral, the investors he had brought in with exaggerated claims about his personal assets, the documentation of every time I had quietly intervened to prevent his company from collapsing, were enough to end him professionally in a way that would have been swift and comprehensive. I had access to attorneys who had built careers doing exactly that, but I kept coming back to the terminal, to Wade's phone, to the way Colin had performed warmth for the people watching while threatening me in a voice calibrated to stay off the recording. If I responded with the same architecture, strategic exposure, maximum damage timed for public impact, I would be doing the same thing they had done with better resources. I would be turning my mother's death into content. I didn't think I could live inside that version of winning, so I chose the harder path. I contacted the independent review firm the board had appointed and told them I would cooperate without conditions. I submitted everything, the full history of the prenuptial trust, the property agreement Colin had signed before our wedding, the access logs from the shared travel account showing exactly when and how my reservation had been modified, and the records of every instance over the years in which I had quietly intervened in Colin's business affairs, the loan extensions, the investor introductions, the debt resolutions he had always attributed to his own timing and relationships. Micah submitted a technical report to the review team, confirming that Colin had logged into my personal account, canceled my booking, collected the travel credit, and used it to purchase Sierra's seat, all within a 30-minute window on the afternoon of my mother's funeral. The airport security system had recorded everything that occurred at and near the departure gate before Lenora arrived, Colin's exact words, Elaine's comments to the crowd, the moment Wade raised his phone. The footage was time-stamped, unedited, and said plainly what had happened. The piece I hadn't anticipated came from Wade. In the days after he posted the clip, he had watched the response build, the shares, the comments, the secondary videos of people reacting to his footage. He was used to that kind of momentum. He had spent years cultivating it. But something about this particular wave felt wrong to him in a way he couldn't initially name. People were being entertained by a woman who had buried her mother 3 hours before the footage was shot. They were calling her calculating cold, a woman who had used her wealth to humiliate a normal family. And Wade had the full video on his phone, the part that came before the part that made everything else make sense, and he had chosen not to include it. He didn't call me. He didn't negotiate terms or consult a lawyer. He contacted the independent review firm, directly sent them the original uncut footage, and submitted a written statement explaining that Colin had specifically asked him to trim the video to remove the context, and that he had complied. At the end of the statement, he wrote, "I should have never started filming. But since I did, at least let the whole thing be seen. It wasn't absolution." He knew that. But it was the most honest thing anyone in that family had done since the afternoon at the airport. And it cost him something real: his brother's trust, his mother's approval, and a version of himself he had been performing for a long time without examining. The independent review was completed 3 weeks after I submitted my documentation. The findings were unambiguous. I had not used my position at Airline to resolve a personal dispute, had not directed any action against Colin or Sierra through company channels, and had not misrepresented my authority at Blue Heron Regional Airport. I had accurately identified myself under direct provocation after my husband had canceled my travel reservation without consent on the day of my mother's funeral. The board restored my executive access in full and issued a formal public apology. The medical transport contract review was closed and the contract proceeded. Colin's legal claim that Airline's assets constituted marital property subject to division was reviewed by 3 separate attorneys before it reached a judge, and none of them could find a path through the prenuptial agreement. The document was clear and properly executed. Any business entity founded with separate capital by either party remained that party's sole property regardless of the length of the marriage. Colin had signed it. He had simply never read it because he had never once imagined a clause like that would matter, because he had never once imagined I was building something it would need to protect. The investors in Vance Leisure Partners began withdrawing after the review process surfaced the financial records Colin had used during fundraising records that significantly overstated his personal assets and implied a connection to Airline that had never existed. Without new capital and without the credibility the marriage had quietly lent him, the company had nothing left to stand on. Sierra quietly ended her professional association with Colin and made no further public statements. I heard later that she had rebuilt her practice with a different kind of client. I didn't follow up. It wasn't my story to track. Elaine continued defending her son publicly until the creditors began arriving at her door with paperwork. She called me once during that period and said something about family loyalty that I listened to in full. When she finished, I told her I hoped she found the support she needed and ended the call. Colin called more than once. Most of the calls I didn't answer. The last one I did. He told me he had made a mistake, that 12 years couldn't be discarded over one flight, that he wanted to find a way through this. I told him that what happened at the airport had never been about the flight. It had been about the moment he decided I had nothing left to offer him, and therefore had no claim to basic human decency. The flight was just the form that decision happened to take that afternoon. Before I ended the call, he asked if I would consider some kind of bridge arrangement to help stabilize Vance Leisure Partners through the transition. I told him, "I'm not destroying your life, Colin. I'm just not holding it up anymore." The divorce was finalized several months later. There was less to divide than Colin had believed, and the process was cleaner than I expected, which is what happens when the paperwork was written carefully a long time ago by someone who understood that hope and legal documentation are not the same thing. On the first clear morning after everything was settled, I drove back to Blue Heron Regional Airport. Not to make a statement. Not to hold a press moment about resilience or reinvention. I went because there was something I wanted to do in that specific place, and I wanted to do it quietly. I announced the Dorothy Keen Passage Fund, a program providing emergency travel assistance, temporary lodging, and ground transportation to low-income individuals who need to return home for the death of a parent or close family member. The fund gives priority to single caregivers, to women leaving controlling relationships, and to families at risk of being stranded in airports during the worst moments of their lives. There is no large portrait of me at the assistance counter. There is no mounted biography or origin story on the wall. There is only a small silver compass behind glass and a single line printed beneath it. No one should be stranded in grief. I kept the real compass. It's in my coat pocket right now. About a year after the fund launched, I boarded one of the first flights it helped finance. I had a middle seat between a man who fell asleep before takeoff and a woman reading a paperback with a bent spine. Neither of them knew who I was. The flight attendant didn't recognize me. Nobody asked my name. I used to keep quiet because I had learned slowly, and without quite noticing it happening, that being fully known made my marriage harder to maintain. But sitting on that plane, anonymous, unbothered, no longer in the business of protecting someone else's fragile idea of himself, I understood that the hiding had changed. I wasn't invisible out of fear anymore. I was simply a woman on a plane going somewhere carrying a compass her mother had given her at 16. Colin had canceled the flight that was supposed to take me home. But the thing about that, the thing I don't think he ever understood, is that the version of home he thought he was keeping me from had already stopped existing long before that afternoon. What he actually did standing at that gate with his arm around Sierra and his family's phones raised was show me clearly and without ambiguity what had been true for years. Home was never a place defined by his presence in it. Home was the place where I didn't have to be smaller than I was to be loved. And I had been looking for it at the wrong address for a very long time. If this story stayed with you, I think you already know why. The most dangerous thing we can do in a relationship, or anywhere really, is spend so long making ourselves smaller that we forget what our actual size feels like. Sabrina didn't win because she was a billionaire. She won the moment she stopped needing Colin to confirm her worth. If you believe someone in your life needs to hear a story like this one, share it with them. And if you want more stories about people who chose dignity over approval, subscribe. New episodes every week. I'll see you in the next one.